and he was trying to fight inflation, and he's pointing out, hey, I'm trying to put out the fire. You guys keep lighting fires. Give me a little help here, right? That's what Powell is supposed to be doing. If he's supposed to be fighting inflation, he should be lecturing Congress to stop lighting the fires that he claims to be trying to put out.
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
I did write down this congressman's name. It's Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman. And he basically tried to congratulate Powell for bringing inflation back down to 4%. And I don't think it's actually quite that low yet. But he said 4%. I think it's more like 5, but I don't know. Maybe one of the indexes was 4. And he basically said, look, I think we're done here. I think 4% is pretty good. And he said that, 4% historically is not high inflation. He said it's lower than the average rate of inflation during the Reagan administration, which is probably true because remember, Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. He was elected in 1980 when inflation was 13% and it was just starting to come down. So to say that, well, we have a lower rate of inflation than we did in the 1980s, when inflation was a huge problem, and just starting to go away is not really saying much. And 4% is a lot of inflation. I mean, it's double what the Fed claims its target is, right? So if it wants 4 is twice what it claims is ideal. But again, what this congressman overlooks is the apples to oranges comparison between the inflation rate today and the inflation rate during the early 1980s when we had a completely different CPI. So if we still measured inflation today using the inflation of CPI of the early 80s, the 4% would be 8%. And 8% doesn't sound so good. I mean, 4% doesn't sound good either. But, basically he's defending 8% inflation and trying to claim that, hey, that's not bad. Well, that is eviscerating the purchasing power of middle-class Americans, of lower-class Americans, impoverishing a lot of the people that these congressmen claim to represent. But the thing that bothers me the most, and it wasn't just the House, it was also, again, at the Senate, but there were congressmen all on the Republican side, right? None on the Democratic side. They are trying to get Powell to comment on the budget deficits. We got the national debt, as I mentioned on my last podcast, above 32 trillion. We're going to make it a beeline now for 33 trillion. But the deficits are running out of control. And we have massive spending. And the Republicans are trying to get Powell to make the obvious connection between these deficits and inflation, right? I mean, even Keynesians who really don't even understand economics should ought to know that, right? That if you have excess fiscal stimulus, right, you have massive deficits, you're going to have inflation. You're stimulating demand. You're not stimulating supply. You're just creating more demand for a given supply. The price has got to go up, especially if the Fed is, printing the money to monetize those deficits. And Powell continues to claim that he's not allowed to do that. He's like, look, I can't go out of my lane. I'm responsible for monetary policy. I can't talk about fiscal policy. It's the same with all my predecessors. I mean, we just don't go there. It's not in our wheelhouse. We don't want to overstep our bounds. This is complete BS. I mean, I think that they're trying to flip on its head the idea that the government should allow the Fed to be independent, where Congress shouldn't be beating up on the Fed to, print more money or cut rates, right? That the central bank should be independent. It doesn't work the other way around. We're not supposed to have an independent central bank so that it won't criticize the government. No. Part of the reason to have an independent central bank is precisely so it will criticize the government because they are above politics, right? The central bankers supposedly don't have to get elected, so they can do what's in the public interest. And if congressmen who do need to get reelected are sacrificing the public's interest for political expediency, it's the job of an independent central bank to call out the reckless fiscal policy. And that is exactly the job that Powell is refusing to do. A, because he's a coward, and B, he's lying, because I went back and I actually tweeted some of this stuff out. When Paul Volcker was chairman of the Fed, and Powell has spoken fondly of Volcker and how Volcker, did a great job, and he beat down inflation and he restored credibility. It's like, Powell is supposedly, or Volcker is one of Powell's heroes. Well, if that's the case, Paul Volcker was a staunch critic of deficit spending, even under Reagan, because there were some big deficits under Reagan. I mean, not, by, today's terms. I mean, you're talking about budget deficits of, I don't know what it was, $150 billion a year. I mean, they're 10 times that size now. But these were big deficits back in the 80s. And Volcker was very critical of these deficits. He said, you got to do something. You got to cut government spending or raise taxes. But he was specific, and he gave speeches to and called on Congress to cut defense spending, specifically cut defense, cut entitlements, cut Social Security, cut Medicare. This is what Volcker was telling Congress to do. And he said, you got to do this. Otherwise, we're going to have more inflation. It's going to put upward pressure on long-term interest rates. It's going to hurt the economy. You've got to get the fiscal house in order. You got to cut spending. Now, he was the Fed chairman. He had no problem not only commenting on fiscal policy, but directly criticizing fiscal policy and giving Congress advice as to what he thought they should be doing to correct the mistakes that he was pointing out. And he was trying to fight inflation, and he's pointing out, hey, I'm trying to put out the fire. You guys keep lighting fires. Give me a little help here, right? That's what Powell is supposed to be doing. If he's supposed to be fighting inflation, he should be lecturing Congress to stop lighting the fires that he claims to be trying to put out. He should be doing exactly what his hero, Paul Volcker, did, and criticizing the government. And it wasn't just Volcker. Alan Greenspan, and I've said a lot of negative things about Alan Greenspan, and Alan Greenspan had the longest term of any Fed chairman. But one of the things that he routinely did was criticize deficit spending. And in fact, I looked at quotes from his very last congressional testimony at the end of his final term, right? And he's in the exact same chair that Powell's in. And his last remarks to Congress were, you got to do something about the deficit. We're going to have a explosion, a fiscal time bomb. This is the biggest threat. You got to cut government spending. You got to balance this budget. He was still chairman of the Fed, and he's telling Congress what they need to do with fiscal policy, the mistakes that they are making with fiscal policy. So I wish one of these congressmen or senators would ask Chair Powell, Mr. Powell, you claim that you don't have the right to comment on fiscal policy. Let alone, he definitely won't criticize it, but he claims he can't even comment on it. He can't even talk about it like, theoretically, like it's sacrosanct, right? When was there a law passed that did this? When were these handcuffs put on the Fed? Because they clearly weren't on Volcker. They weren't on Greenspan. Now, I didn't do much research into Yellen or Bernanke. I doubt they were big critics of the fiscal policy of the government, but not because they couldn't, maybe because they didn't want to, maybe because they didn't care. But now, when you have a Fed chairman being asked by so many congressional representatives, give us your opinion. We want to know what you think of these deficits. And he says, I can't tell you. I'm not allowed. Based on what law? Because if if Volcker was allowed, if Greenspan was allowed, and if Congress hasn't passed any legislation that would somehow inhibit the Fed from commenting on fiscal policy, then why can't he do it? The reason is he's copping out. He doesn't want to comment because he doesn't want to put these politicians in the spot and call them out. But that's exactly what he needs to do. And the fact that he won't do it, that is more proof that we don't have an independent central bank. He's trying to claim, the central bank is independent, so we won't criticize Congress. No. If the central bank was independent, they would be criticizing Congress. The fact that they're not criticizing it proves that there's no independence. Anyway, also, Powell commented too. He tried to say that, look, there is no real link between the big balance sheet, all the QE, and inflation, because we were doing QE for a long time and we had really low inflation. Yes, because the government lied about it, the way they measured it, but there is a big lag. Yes, there was a long period of time between the creating of the inflation and the effect that inflation had on prices. As I said many, many times, the Fed got lulled into a false sense of complacency in that it created inflation for so long without any seemingly adverse consequences, because the official measures of inflation were still below 2%. And so that gave them a false sense of confidence that they could keep on creating inflation by printing money and that prices wouldn't go up. Well, now all of a sudden it hit them like a brick, and now we're dealing with years and years of inflation chickens that have come home to roost, and Powell is still not recognizing the connection there. Now, I'm going to move forward to the Senate. And the opening remarks, and here the Democrats are in charge. So you got the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee is Senator Sherrod Brown. And the first thing he did was he thanked Powell for bringing down inflation. And he said that it is great now that Americans are enjoying falling prices. I'm not making this up. He said falling prices. And prices aren't falling. I don't know what this guy's talking about. Some prices have fallen, right? Gas prices have come down from the highs where they were. But the CPI isn't falling. It's still going up. It's just going up at a slower rate. That's probably what he meant, but that's not what he said. In fact, he wasn't just speaking off the cuff. He was reading, prepared remarks. And so either he wrote them or somebody else wrote them, and they were able to think about them. But he said that that Americans are now benefiting from falling prices. They're not. Prices are still rising, so they're still suffering. The prices that were too high last year are even higher this year because prices continue to go up. Even if they have reduced the rate of increase, they're still increasing at a rate that's too high, and that's just temporary. Now, another thing that Powell did was he assured the Senate that the banking system is sound. It's not sound at all. He said it was sound and resilient. But he assured the U.S. Senate that the banking system was sound and resilient. It's anything but. If it wasn't for the government propping the banks up right now, that we would already had a complete implosion. We've already had some of the biggest bank failures in history, this year. And if it wasn't for the government coming to the rescue, there would have been more. Now, of course, if it wasn't for the government, they wouldn't be so insolvent.